It's not till 727, as far away as Banbor in Pakistan, that he gets the first mosque to face Mecca. 727. Muhammad died in 632. Almost 100 years later, before he finds the first mosque that is facing Mecca. Then in 728, in Syria, here the mosque is not facing Petra or Mecca. They don't know where they're to face. And here's an interesting one. Here is the one in Amman in Jordan. Take a look at the lower mosque. The lower mosque is facing Petra. That was built in 700. Then it was rebuilt up here. Another mosque was rebuilt in 740, and this one now faces Mecca. The 700 mosque faces Petra. The 740 mosque up here faces Mecca. Finally, they get it right. But look at the date, 740. The Musta Mosque in Amman in 743. That's 743, and still it's facing Petra. It should be facing Mecca. And then in North Africa, it looks like they don't know where they're to face, because almost all the mosques in North Africa, this one in Tunisia, is not facing Petra or Mecca, it's facing directly south. In Cordoba, Spain, again, 784, it doesn't know where to face. It's facing, again, neither Petra or Mecca. Here's another one in Tunisia, in Karaoun, in 817. It's neither facing Petra or Mecca, it's facing somewhere south. So what is his conclusion? Every mosque, up until 725, every mosque in the first 100 years is facing Petra. And then for the next 100 years, between 725 and 822, 12% are facing Petra, 50% are facing Mecca, 38% are facing parallel. It takes them to 822 to finally get every mosque to face Mecca. Takes them 200 years to finally get it right. Now, I've heard Muslims try to come back and say, well, they didn't know where directions were. Now, please, hold on a minute. These were camel herders. They went through the deserts. There were no roads in the deserts. How did they find their way? How could they find these oases in the middle of these sand dunes? They used the stars. Certainly they knew where Petra was, and they knew where Mecca was. And what's most curious, why is it that every mosque up until 725, all of them are facing Petra, from as far away as China? That's what's curious. The fact that uniformly, they're all facing Petra for about 100 years after Muhammad's death. If you take a look and see why, look where Petra is. Petra is at the center of the trades. It's at the center of the world at that time. I don't know how many of you have been to Petra. Have anybody here been to Petra? What have you noticed about Petra? It's a city of tombs and temples, isn't it? Beautiful, beautiful carvings out of the solid rock. And you go there and you will see that this is the center of the Nabatean civilization. The Nabateans were the precursors to the Arabs. Arabic comes from Nabatean script. Almost all the traditions that we see in Arabia come from Nabateans. They were the precursors. They were the ones that introduced Arabia. They were the ones that gave it its language. And they were the ones that we can trace all the way back to the 2nd century BC. We can trace that this was the center of the world. This was a center of worship. This is where all the temples were facing. And that's why all these mosques were still following the same direction that all the temples have been following. But take a look at Petra a little closer. Petra is in a valley. It also has a parallel valley. There's a stream going right through Petra. It has fields, trees, grasses. It has clay. It has loam. It has olive trees. It is near the pillar of salt. In fact, it's Petra in a valley, has all of the items listed in both the Quran and the traditions. Thus, it looks like it's Petra that is a place the Quran and the traditions are referring to. Why is that significant? Remember, we don't know nothing about Muhammad until the late 7th century. We know no reference to him until the 690s. His biography is not even written till the 9th century. His city of Mecca isn't referred to until the 8th century. Thus, much of what we know of Muhammad is written down hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away. It looks like he is nothing more than a later redaction, possibly by Abdul al-Malik. Hold that under your hat, because now we get to the real juicy material. This is the one that I just found out about a few months ago. And I did a debate on this on June 22nd. And this has to do with the Quran, this book. See, if you can push Muhammad back quite a few years, but what are you going to do with this book? Because this is the foundation of Islam. That's why we have confronted this book, and I've been doing so for now 30 years. What are we going to do with this book? Because this book is what every Muslim has to adhere to. This is the book that has always been. This is the book that is uncreated. This is the book, according to Surah 85, Ayah 22, that comes from those eternal tablets that have always coexisted with God. Therefore, it's co-eternal with God. This book cannot be critiqued. This book cannot be criticized. This book has no history. It is revealed to a man named Muhammad over a period of 610 to 632, 22 years, according to every Muslim. Whether they are radical, nominal, or liberal, every Muslim believes that this book is the uncreated Quran. Can you see what they're saying? The Quran is the greatest wonder among the wonders of the world. This book is second to none in the world according to the unanimous decision of the learned men in points of diction, style, rhetoric, thoughts, and soundness of law and regulations to shape the destinies of mankind. That's in the hadith, the Mishkat al-Masabi, which is a compilation of the 6 most authoritative hadith. Muslims will say, Muhammad hath forged it. Answer, bring therefore a chapter like unto it, and call whom you be to your assistant besides Allah if ye speak. This is the greatest of all revelations, they tell me. I've had many debates. I remember doing a debate with Sheikh Umar Bakri Muhammad there in Trafalgar Square, right there on Nelson's column, in front of 5,000 Muslims who were there to have a rally for Islam in an August afternoon. There, back in the 1990s. I got up, he asked me to come up onto the plinth with him. Sheikh Umar Bakri Muhammad is probably the most radical cleric there is. And we had a debate, a impromptu debate for about 45 minutes in front of all these thousands of Muslims on the Quran itself. And after about 45 minutes, he finally turned to me and he said, well, listen, if you don't like the Quran that much, then bring therefore a chapter like it. Show me anything that can equal this book. And I took out my Bible and I opened up to Psalm 23. And I just started reading Psalm 23. And I started reading it, they turned off the microphone. So I spoke up, I went to the edge of the plinth and I used my speaker's corner voice, which is pretty loud. And I finished Psalm 23. I turned towards the Sheikh and I said, you show me a chapter like that. Show me any chapter that can equal Psalm 23. And I could have gone to Psalm 1 or Psalm 2 or any of the Psalms. I could have gone to 1 Corinthians 13. I could have gone to Matthew 5, Matthew 6, any of my favorite chapters. And you will find that many chapters, many verses are superior to the Quran. Yep. So when it happens to you, you say the same thing. Yet for today, what we need to ask is, this is what the Muslims claim. It is the greatest of all revelation. It has never been created. That means every word, every letter that's in this book, in the Arabic, is the same that's there in heaven on the tablets. It has no history. It has no human intervention. It was sent down, word for word, by Jibril to a man named Muhammad who could not read or write. That's curious. And finally written down 18 years after Muhammad was dead. That's even more curious. Nonetheless, every Muslim will say that they can trace this book, unlike the Bible, they can trace this book all the way back to its origins. They can trace it all the way back to what they call the Uthmanic recension. This is the Uthmanic recension. This is the same book that was compiled by Uthman, that he had those 4 men, Zubair, Alas, Harith, and Zayd ibn Thabit. The 4 men write that Quran. That's what they say. It's not me saying it. This is what the Muslims say. When was it written down? According to Al-Bukhari, and this is what Al-Bukhari's written, you can see it on the right there, this is the translation on the left, that Uthman in 650 did not have the entire corrected Quran text at hand, as Al-Bukhari admits. A large part of the Quran may be lost, for he then orders 3 to help Zayd ibn Thabit, Zubair, Alas, and Harith, to revise the codex, which was given to Hafsa, the daughter of Umar, and correct it where necessary, even recalling a verse, chapter 33, verse 23, which had been missing from the original text. Isn't that curious? Uthman then takes Hafsa's Quranic manuscript and has the 4 compilers rewrite the text. And in case they disagreed, they were to write it in the dialect of the Quraysh, and ordered that all the other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscript or whole copies, be burnt. Why would you burn manuscripts? Unless they disagreed. He then sent every Muslim province 1 copy of what had been copied. And that's what Muslims have told me for 30 years. And that's what you've heard. That 4 copies were then made of the original Quran. 1 was left in Medina, 1 was sent to Basra, 1 was sent to Baghdad, and 1 was sent to Damascus. Have you heard this? Every Muslim will tell you this. And if there are any Muslims here in the room tonight, you will agree that there have been 4 original copies. Where are those copies? That's what we're asking tonight. Where are those copies? And I've asked this for 30 years. And in every debate, I've asked, where are those copies? Now, Muslims always tell me that 2 of the copies still exist today. One is called the Topkapi manuscript, which is in the Topkapi Palace, there in the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul, in Turkey. And the other is called the Samarkand manuscript, which is in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan. This is the Topkapi manuscript, and there's a picture of it. The Topkapi manuscript. If you look up on the screen, you will notice, if you look carefully, you can see some blood stain right there. See some blood stain on it right there? That, according to Islamic tradition, is the blood stain of Uthman. He was reading it, and while he was reading, he was killed, and that's his blood on the copy. So this is an original Uthmanic recension. This is what every Muslim tells me. And if there's any Muslims here tonight, please tell me I'm wrong. Because this is what every Muslim has told me. This is the original copy. In Turkey, in Istanbul. And there's been no reason for me to disagree, because I've never been able to look at it. None of us have been able to do any study on it. We can't do any forensic testing. I'd love to do some accelerated mass spectrography. I'd love to be able to do some carbon testing on it, dating it to make sure that this is from the 7th century. We're not able to touch it. No one can touch it. This is the other one, the second one, the Samarkand. There's a picture of it up on the wall. The Samarkand is in Tashkent. That, according to Muslims, is the second manuscript. These are what are known as the Uthmanic recensions. Now, since no one has been able to look at it, of course, there's been a problem. We've just had to take them at their word. That wasn't until 2002. In 2002, 2 men in Turkey were then given access to this manuscript and also to the Tashkent manuscript. These 2 men are known as Dr. Ekmeledin Ihsanoglu and Dr. Tayyar Altıkılıç. The reason they were given access to it is because they are the ones that actually control those manuscripts. They live in Turkey. Dr. Tayyar Altıkılıç is the world's scholar, leading scholar in Quranic studies, ex-president of Turkish Religious Affairs, deputy in the Turkish parliament. He was given access to it in 2002, and for 5 years, he was able then to look at it from 2002 until 2007. I was only given his response. I was only given their response in May of this year, and here it is right here. This is 83 pages long. Actually, it's a 1,000-page book that they finally wrote. I only found out about this in May of this year. And let's hear what they are now saying. Now remember, these are the only scholars who have been given access to any of these manuscripts. And it's not just these 2. I'll go about 4 other manuscripts as well. According to Dr. Ertan Ihsanoglu, he says that the Topkapi manuscript is not Uthmanic at all. Nor do we have any of the copies of these musafs. These musafs, that's the manuscripts, date from the later Umayyad period. Dr. Tayyar Altıkılıç goes on, he says there's no serious scholarly work has been done on them. These musafs date from the early mid-8th century. They are not Uthmanic, nor copies sent by him. The Topkapi manuscript, in fact, he says, has 2,270 manuscript variants. That means consonantal differences between that manuscript and the text that we have today. 2,270. The Tashkent manuscript. He said when he looked at it, he realized that there were some problems here. It was obvious that whoever wrote that manuscript did not know Arabic very well. It has undisciplined spelling, different writing styles, scribal mistakes, copyist mistakes, written by someone with little experience, with later additions, and it only goes up to Surah 43. There's 114 surahs in the Quran. It's not even complete. Then he was given access to the Husayni manuscript, which is another one of these supposed Uthmanic recensions. Dr. Tayyar Altıkılıç said this is not Uthmanic. It is dated from the early mid-century. The Paris Petropatalines manuscript, which is in France, in Paris, done by Dr. François Deroche, says that there are 5 different copies. Corrections were made to the text. When comparing with the Cairo edition, which is this canonized text, there are many words turn out to be written in a different way. Many questions still remain unanswered. What was more, he said, that it disagrees with the canonical readings in 93 places. Why haven't we been told this before? When they looked at the Ma'il Quran, which is in London, which is where I live, the Ma'il Quran, considered to be the 2nd oldest Quran, dated to the late 8th century. It is not 7th century. It is not even complete. It only goes up to Surah 43. And then when they looked at the Sana manuscript, probably the most damaging, the Sana manuscript, which was discovered in 1975 in Yemen, the Germans were permitted to look at it in 1981. Dr. Gerhard Pwin and Dr. Karl-Heinz Oleg then looked in 1981, and they found that there were many deviations mentioned in later manuscripts. Just take a look at this picture here. This is from their copies of it. Here you have Surah 19. That's written in Hijazi text. That's the script that would have been around in the 7th and 8th century. From 19, right at that yellow mark, it jumps to Surah 22. What happened to Surah 20 and 21? Surah 21 begins over on the next page in a completely different script, in a much later script. There's about 60 years between these two pages. So why haven't we been told this? Yet this script here is dated to 705, over here to the late 8th century. Take a look at every one of those orange marks. Every one of those orange marks are what we know as manuscript variants. That means words or phrases in that script that's different than the canonized text we have today. There's over 1,000 of these manuscript variants. Yet Muslims tell us that the Quran has never changed. The Quran has always remained the same. That this is God's holy text. That it is complete. And that it was complete by the time of Uthman. There's another picture of another page. When they looked at the palimpsest, now when they noticed that all of these manuscripts are written on skins, animal skins. We know them as parchment or vellum. And when they would write on the animal skins, they would wash it off and then write over top. And if you look carefully, you can see there's some writing underneath. See the writing underneath there? See the writing underneath there? They noticed this writing underneath, so they put it under an ultraviolet light, and by putting it under ultraviolet light, they can split the texts and bring them aside and look at the two texts. And the lower script is known as defective script, the upper script is known as the final script. When they looked at the defective script of the Sana manuscript, they noticed that that was from the time of Abd al-Malik, basically the last 2 decades of the 7th century. The upper script was the time just after Abd al-Malik, probably Marwan, or his son, Ibn Malik. And take a look and look at the script, and you will see that it does not agree with the Quran we have today. So what is that telling us? What was exciting is that on the back of every one of these folios, I have pictures of every one of these manuscripts, but on the back I have quoted what the Muslims are now telling us. What you read on the back of this, I can give this out to people if they want to come up and read it afterwards, are what the Muslims are now admitting. They are now admitting that none of the musafs, none of the manuscripts are from the 7th century. That every one of the manuscripts is from the 8th century. Which means that the first manuscripts that even appear, that even come into existence, don't come into existence until 60 to 70 years after Muhammad. There is no manuscript that's earlier than that. Ooh, I love this. It makes my job a lot easier. Can you see why this is so damaging? Because if the first manuscripts that we see here, all these manuscripts, the Huzayni manuscript, the Paris Petropolitanus manuscript, the Ma'il Quran from London, the Sana manuscript from Sana in Yemen, if all of these manuscripts do not appear to the 8th century, then you can see, of course, what this is going to do to Muhammad. This means Muhammad had nothing to do with the Quran. And in one fell swoop, we have destroyed the Quran and Muhammad simultaneously. And what happens to Islam? Now, I introduced this in June 22nd, the first time I'd heard about this, because I had always assumed that these Qurans began with Uthman. It wasn't until May of this year that I found out different. I went to this debate and I introduced it at the debate. The debater, Adnan Rashid, who's considered probably one of the best debaters in Britain today, had no response. He held up a coin. He says, Mr. Smith, if you don't believe that the Quran existed in the 7th century, take a look at this coin. There you can see the name of Muhammad written on it. There you can see the Shahada. I said, exactly. Do you know who made that coin? His name is Abd al-Malik. You just made my point. He introduces that coin in 691. I've just got done saying that. It is he that introduces Muhammad as a prophet on that coin and also on the Dome of the Rock. It's Abd al-Malik who is the one that creates and begins the first Quran. It's Abd al-Malik, the one that names who the prophet's going to be. It's Abd al-Malik who is one that introduces the name Muslim. It's Abd al-Malik who introduces the name Islam. It all begins with Abd al-Malik. You're going to hear this name more and more. And have you noticed that all the mosques are facing Petra until immediately after Abd al-Malik, and then they start to face Mecca? It all begins with Abd al-Malik. So who is Abd al-Malik? He was the caliph from 6 85 to 705. He is the one that is known as the great Arab reformer. He takes and creates an identity for Arabs. And what do you do when you try to create an identity for Arabs? Remember, they had already taken over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo, these cities that are all over the Levant. They had now taken over all of North Africa, gone all the way to India in the east and Spain in the west. This they did by the end of the 7th century. But all their traditions were dependent on Judeo-Christian prophets. All their traditions come in the line of Isaac, and they're not from that line. They needed a prophet who comes from Ishmael. So what do? You create a prophet. And you redact it back to the man who started the conquest. And we know that Muhammad is historical. He is the one that begins the conquests. He dies in 632. But if he's a prophet, he has to have a book. So you start amassing and borrowing from many different sources. And look at the Quran. It is full of borrowing. 70% of the Quran we can now trace back to Jewish apocryphal writings and Christian sectarian writings. There's nothing new under the sun. They borrow right, left, and center. But when you start compiling it, there are going to be different Qurans. You can see there were different schools. There was one school in Damascus where a man named Abu Ubay ibn Ka'b had a manuscript that was different from Basra, where there was another Quran that was written by a man named Ibn Musa, which is different from another Quran that was in Baghdad named Ibn Masud, which is different from another Quran that was in Medina, written by a man Zayd ibn Thabit. You remember those names? These are all in their traditions. I'm referring to their own traditions. Dr. Arthur Jeffries in the 1930s looked at all these traditions, and he just looked at what they said about the Quran. And when he looked at the Quran, he found out that there were 11 different Qurans mentioned in the traditions, and there were 15,000 differences between these 11 Qurans. Now, why haven't Muslims told us this? Can you see? It makes my job a lot easier. But can you see what we're doing tonight? Everything I've said tonight is now agreed by Western scholars. Western scholars are now concluding that the earliest Quranic manuscripts begin to appear in the 8th century. Muslim scholars conclude that the earliest musafs appear in the 8th century. And now, finally, Islamic awareness. Islamic awareness is probably the biggest Muslim website that deals with manuscript evidence. They've been a pain in our side for the last 30 years. Go up on their website and look at their manuscript section. They are now quoting Dr. Tahir Altukulich. They have to. They have no other choice. And they are, for the first time, finally admitting that there is no complete manuscript at all in the 7th century. Isn't this great? Yes. Isn't it great to be living at this time? Yes. Can you see that we have now used the same traditions? Remember, the same thing was said of our Bible back in the 1800s. Wellhausen, there in Tübingen, there in Germany, started attacking our Bible, saying that much of the Bible is nothing more than redactions, many oral traditions, folk tales that were put together possibly in the 6th century BC, redacted to a man named Moses in 1400 BC, about a man named Abraham in 1900 BC, but that we can't trust any of it. Remember when that came out? And there was a documentary hypothesis, and then there was the redacted criticism, there was source criticism, there was literary criticism, higher and lower criticism, and by 1905, this had moved down into the seminaries, had come down into the churches, and all across Europe, the churches were decimated. Destroyed the church by 1905. So that today in Europe, only 5% of people go to church. See what historical criticism has done to our Bible. But we were jacked up. We realized we've got to do our homework. And that's why we started looking around and finding artifact after artifact. And God bless the British. They went all over the world and they stole everything they could and put it into the British Museum so we could look at it. And if you come to London, I will take you to the British Museum, and you've got to see all the artifacts in the British Museum from the Assyrian period, the 9th and 8th and 7th century BC, from the Babylonian period, from the 7th and 6th century BC, up into the Persian period that supports 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Come and see how it supports the book of Genesis, the book of Jeremiah, the book of Daniel. Oh, it's beautiful. All of it using the same criticisms that we've asked of Islam. We can now support almost every. In fact, there has not been one piece of evidence that has now been found that controverts one properly understood biblical statement. Amen. That's how good our Bible is. We have passed the test. And if you want to look at the New Testament, Just come and look at what we have now found. We have now found 12 either partial pieces of manuscripts from the 2nd century. We have now found 68 manuscripts from the 3rd century. We have found 46 from the 4th century. You add that up, that's 124 manuscripts that predate the Sinaiticus, the first complete 27-book manuscript there in the British Library. If you look at those 124 partial manuscripts, you can reproduce the New Testament many times over. And that's 300 years before the Quran even came into existence. We have 230 manuscripts that predate the 6th century. That's 100 years before the Quran even came to existence. What did I say came into existence? Oh, excuse me, the 8th century. The first Quran only begins to appear in the 8th century. Ooh, I love my Bible. And it makes my job an awful lot easier. See, we're asking the same questions of Islam that we've asked of our own Bible. We've passed that test. The Bible passed every test. Source criticism, redacted criticism, the documentary hypothesis, every one of them have been answered. And that's why I take my Bible everywhere I go. And I love it when they say it's been corrupted. I just ask 2 simple words, where and when? Where and when? And then I have the platform to just talk about my Bible for the next hour. And you can do the same. You can do the same. Islamic Awareness has now agreed that all the musafs, all the earliest manuscripts, that includes the Topkapi, that includes the Samarkand, that includes the Sana manuscript, that includes the Ma'il manuscript, that also includes the Husseini manuscript, and also the Petropatanus Paris manuscript. Every one of those earliest 6 manuscripts are all from the 8th century. None of them from the 7th century. So therefore, if the Western scholars agree, if the Muslim scholars agree, if Islamic Awareness agrees, therefore, I conclude that if the earliest musafs begin to appear in the 8th century, then Muhammad had nothing to do with the Quran. That's my conclusion. Now, I was there in the mid-July, I was there on the ladder, and I looked down into the crowd of Muslims that were below me, and I noticed that one of the Muslims in the crowd was from Islamic Awareness. His name is Mansour Ahmad. He's one of the writers for the Islamic Awareness. He had his camera on me as I was showing these different pictures of these different musafs, his musafs. I turned to Mansour and I said, everything I'm reading comes from your website. And I just read from his website, quote after quote after quote. I said to Mansour, you say that the Quran has never changed. You tell me that the Quran is perfect. You tell me that the Quran is complete. And that there has been no manuscript that has been destroyed, that all the manuscripts agree. Yet here, I'm just showing you from your own website that the Topkapi manuscript has 2,270 difference from the Quran we have today. That the Samarkand that you believe was perfect only goes up to Surah 43, was written by an amateur. You're the ones that are writing this on your website. I said, I therefore challenge you to find one complete manuscript from the time of Uthman. One complete manuscript from the 7th century. He closed up his camera and walked away. He had no response. It makes my job an awful lot easier. Now, the historical assessment concerning Islam, that the first Arab inscriptions referencing Muhammad only begin in 691. The first reference to Muslims until 690s. The first Arab reference to Muslim is just prior to 749. The first reference to Islam is not till 691. I've already said this. And the first reference to Mecca, not till 741. Can you see what we're now dealing with? There's an awful lot of work yet to be done. We now are going to have to piece all the pictures together. We don't have a complete understanding of what this all says. But what we can now say pretty much categorically is that the Quran does not come from God. It probably began with Abdul Malik. And it certainly does not come from Muhammad. And if we don't know anything about Muhammad until the late 7th century, and we don't even have his biography until the 9th century, then should we trust any of it? Now, I want to be careful. If there are any Muslims in the audience, I'm not here to destroy Muslims. I'm here to destroy your Quran. I have nothing against Muslims. It's this book that bothers me. Because it's this book that does to you what I see going around the world. It's this book that damages women. It's this book that damages men. It's this book that damages my God. It's this book that damages Jesus Christ. That's why I can only confront this book. And it's your prophet that takes this book and supposedly gives it credibility. That's why we're doing what we're doing tonight. And I want to tell Muslims, listen, this book no longer is the Word of God, but this book is. Please don't give up God. Come on home to this God. Please don't give up revelation. Come on home to this revelation. Please don't give up Isa. Come on home to Yeshua, the real Jesus. I love the passion of Muslims. I love the fact that they do love God and they want to obey God. I just want to bring them home to the real God. I love the fact that they are willing to give their lives for their Quran. They don't need to anymore. Give their life to Jesus Christ. So I ask Muslims in the audience tonight and those who are watching, please, I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here to bring you home. Come on home.